On a cold Saturday morning in March of 1987, in Montgomery County, Iowa, a folding table stood alone at the edge of the courthouse square, its legs sinking slightly into thawing ground, its surface lined with mason jars of honey, crooked carrots, and eggs still dusted with straw. Behind it stood Walter Griggs, 72 years old, 48 seasons on the same 120 acres just outside Red Oak, hands like split oak, knuckles swollen, fingernails permanently stained with grease and soil. He wore the same brown coat he'd worn every winter since 1969, patched twice at the elbow. Across the street, a man in a pressed navy overcoat checked his watch. Frank Donnelly, Vice President of Agricultural Lending at First Plains Bank. 41, clean shoes, clean hands. A man who measured land in spreadsheets, not footsteps. At exactly 8:15 a.m., he crossed the street. He didn't look at the honey, didn't touch the eggs. He looked at Walter. "Mr. Griggs," he said, voice clipped, "you're 36 days past due on your note. $42,000. The bank's prepared to begin seizure proceedings Monday." Walter didn't answer right away. He reached down, turned one jar of honey, so the light hit it just right, golden, clear, slow. Then he said, "You might want to come back next Saturday." Frank blinked. "I won't need to," he said. "This town's finished." Walter nodded once, slow, like he'd heard that before. "Let me tell you about Red Oak in 1987. Population just under 6,000, down from nearly 8,500 in 1960. 2 hardware stores gone. The old grain elevator on 4th Street shuttered in November of '85. 3 farms foreclosed within a 5-mile radius that winter alone. Interest rates had climbed above 10% earlier in the decade. Land values dropped nearly 60% in parts of Iowa between 1981 and 1986. Men who had borrowed to expand suddenly couldn't breathe under the weight of it. Banks didn't care about breadth. Banks cared about numbers. Frank Donnelly was very good with numbers. He had a list that week. 12 farms to review. 8 likely foreclosures. Walter Griggs was supposed to be the easiest one. Old man, outdated equipment, no sons on the land, no expansion, no adaptation, a quiet ending. That's what Frank expected. What he didn't expect was a tractor. It sat 50 yards behind Walter's barn, a 1949 Farmel M, 38 horsepower, 4-cylinder gasoline engine, weighing just over 5,300 pounds without ballast. Bought new by Walter's father, Henry Griggs, in the spring of 1950 for $1,450 from a dealer in Creston. It had never left the farm. Not once. The paint was mostly gone now, bare metal showing through in long gray streaks. The seat cracked, the steering wheel worn smooth to a shine that only comes from decades of hands gripping the same place. But the engine still turned over on the second pull of the choke. Every time. Let me tell you about that tractor. Henry Griggs didn't buy it because it was new. He bought it because it was simple. No electronics. No unnecessary parts. Cast iron block thick enough to outlast a man who owned it. Walter learned to drive on it at age 9. He learned to fix it at 12. By 16, he could rebuild the carburetor blindfolded. That machine wasn't just equipment. It was memory. It was inheritance. It was proof that something built right could outlive the people who built it. By 1987, men like Frank Donnelly saw it as scrap. By 1987, Walter Griggs saw it as the only thing that still made sense. The first Saturday, Walter sold $73 worth of produce. Honey, eggs, a few jars of canned peaches from the previous summer. Frank drove by at 9:40 a.m. He didn't stop. The second Saturday, there were 2 tables, Walter's and a woman named Clara Jenkins with fresh bread and apple butter. They made $142 between them. Frank noticed. The third Saturday, 4 tables. Then 6. Then 10. No permits. No advertising. No grand plan. Just people showing up. Farmers who couldn't get fair prices from distributors anymore. Families who still had something to grow. Something to make. Something to sell. Walter didn't organize it. He just showed up every Saturday. Same time, same table, same quiet patience. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Something outdated, something slow, something nobody believed in anymore, and you kept it anyway, not out of stubbornness, but because you knew something they didn't. By April, the courthouse square looked different. Cars parked along all four sides. Children running between tables. The smell of bread, soil, and coffee mixing in the cold morning air. Frank came back that month. This time, he didn't stay in the car. He walked straight to Walter's table, looked around, counted 23 vendors. He let out a short laugh. Not loud, not cruel, just dismissive. This doesn't fix a $42,000 problem, he said. Walter looked up, eyes steady. No, he said, but it might fix a few others. Frank shook his head. You're delaying the inevitable. Walter picked up a jar of honey, held it out. Try it. Frank didn't take it. I deal in numbers, Mr. Griggs, not jars. Walter set it back down. Numbers come from somewhere, he said. Frank smiled, thin, professional. Then he turned and laughed, this time louder, enough that two men at the next table heard it. Saturday stands aren't going to save this town, he said, or your farm. Walter didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just said, come back in June. Frank walked away, already writing the report in his head. Foreclosure likely. Recovery minimal. Case closed. But that night, as Walter walked back to the barn, he didn't go inside the house. He went to the tractor, ran his hand along the hood, felt the cold metal, and for the first time in years, he turned the key without needing to go anywhere. The engine started. It idled, and then something changed. The sound carried farther than it should have. A low, steady rumble rolling across the field just outside Red Oak, cutting to thin spring air like something older than the town itself. Walter sat on the seat of the Farm LM, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other on the throttle, listening, not just to the engine, to the rhythm. There's a difference between a machine running and a machine working the way it was built to work. This one wasn't just alive. It was ready. Let me tell you about torque. Most people talk about horsepower because it sounds impressive, bigger numbers, faster machines. But horsepower is about speed, how fast work gets done. Torque is about force, the ability to keep moving under load, even when things get heavy. That Farm M didn't have much horsepower by modern standards, 38, but its torque curve was steady, reliable, built for pull, not flash. It didn't quit when things got hard. It leaned into them. That's what Walter understood, and that's what Frank Donnelly didn't. The following Saturday, Walter didn't bring more produce. He brought something else. He backed the farm onto the square, right up to the edge of the growing market, the engine idling low. People noticed. You don't ignore a machine like that, not in a town that used to depend on them. By 8:30 a.m., a small crowd had gathered. Kids climbed the rear tire. Older men stood back, arms crossed, nodding slowly like they were recognizing an old friend. Walter didn't make a speech. He didn't explain anything. He just let it sit there, running. At 9:10, Clara Jenkins sold out of bread. At 9:25, a man named Earl Thompson asked Walter if he could bring sweet corn next week. At 9:40, someone mentioned bringing handmade tools. At 10:05, a woman from 3 towns over asked where she could sign up. There was no sign up. That was the point. Frank arrived at 10:20. He saw the tractor first, then the crowd, then the line, actual line, people waiting to buy eggs. He frowned, walked closer. This is temporary, he said, more to himself than to Walter. Walter didn't respond. A boy no older than 12 was staring at the engine. Mister, he said, how old is this thing? Walter looked down at him. Older than your father, probably. The boy grinned. Does it still work? Walter nodded once. Better than most things that replaced it. Frank stepped in. You're turning this into a spectacle, he said. Walter finally looked at him. No, he said. I'm reminding people what works. Frank exhaled sharply. You think nostalgia is a business model? Walter shook his head. I think trust is... That word stuck. Frank didn't like words like that. They didn't fit neatly into columns. By May, the market had grown to 30 vendors. Produce, meat, preserves, tools, quilts, cash only, no contracts, no middlemen. Frank started coming every week, not because he believed in it, because he couldn't explain it. And things he couldn't explain bothered him. Let me tell you about Frank Donnelly. He grew up in Omaha, not on a farm, but close enough to see them disappear. His father worked at a grain brokerage. Numbers, futures, margins. Frank learned early that agriculture wasn't about soil. It was about scale, efficiency, expansion. You didn't survive by staying small. You survived by getting bigger, faster than the man next to you. That belief had made him successful. It had also made him blind. By early June, Walter had made 4 consecutive payments on his loan. Small, partial, but consistent. Frank updated the file. Status, improving. Risk, still high. Recommendation, monitor. But something else was happening. Something not in the file. The hardware store reopened. Limited hours. But open. A diner on Main Street extended its Saturday service. People were staying in town longer. Spending more. Talking. The kind of talking that doesn't show up in economic reports. The kind that rebuilds places. Have you ever watched something come back to life that everyone else had already buried? Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just piece by piece. Until one day you realize it never really died. It was just waiting. By mid-June, the market hit 47 vendors. Frank stood at the edge of the square that morning, hands in his coat pockets, watching. He wasn't laughing anymore, but he wasn't convinced either. At 9 a.m., Walter shut off the tractor. Silence fell just for a moment, and in that moment, Frank felt something he couldn't quite name. Then Walter did something unexpected. He handed the keys to someone else, a younger farmer, maybe 30. Your turn, Walter said. The man hesitated. You sure? Walter nodded. Machines like this don't belong to one man forever. Frank stepped forward. What are you doing? He asked. Walter looked at him. Letting it work, he said. The younger man turned the key. The engine started. Same sound, same rhythm. But now, it wasn't just Walter's. Frank watched that, really watched it. And for the first time since March, he didn't see a failing asset. He saw something else. Something that didn't fit in any report he'd ever written. And then Walter said something that stopped him cold. You could help this, Walter said. He didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer, just said it plainly, like he was commenting on the weather. Frank stared at him. Help it, he repeated. Walter nodded. You're good with numbers. Frank almost laughed again. Almost. But it didn't come out the same way this time. This isn't a lending situation, he said. There's no structure, no guarantees. No trust. Walter interrupted. Frank stopped. That word again. Walter gestured toward the square. You see, chaos, he said. I see people solving their own problems. Frank crossed his arms. Without oversight, without interference. Walter corrected. There was a difference, and for the first time, Frank felt it. Let me tell you about June 21st, 1987. It was the first day the market broke $2,000 in total sales. Cash, direct, no invoices, no delays. Farmers who hadn't seen that kind of return in months saw it in 4 hours. Frank didn't have a column for that, but he started keeping track anyway. Privately, quietly, week by week. Numbers began to form. Patterns, consistency, growth. It didn't make sense, but it was real. By July, the bank had paused foreclosure proceedings on 3 additional farms tied indirectly to market, not because of policy, because of pressure. Local, human, unquantifiable. And then came the day everything shifted. July 18th, temperature already pushing 90 degrees by 9 a.m. The square packed, more than 60 vendors. Frank stood near the courthouse steps, clipboard in hand, pretending to observe. But he wasn't observing anymore. He was learning. That's when it happened. A man from Des Moines. Suit, sunglasses, outsider. He walked up to Walter's table, picked up a jar of honey. $5, he said. I can get this for $3 at a supermarket. People nearby turned, waited. The man smirked. You folks really think this is sustainable? And then he laughed, loud, sharp, the kind of laugh meant to cut. It echoed across the square. Frank felt it, because he had laughed like that once. Walter looked at the man. Same calm, same steady eyes. If you can get this for $3, he said, you should. The man blinked. Didn't expect that. But you won't, Walter continued, because what you're paying for here isn't the honey. Silence. The man scoffed. Then what am I paying for? Walter didn't hesitate. You're paying for the person who made it to still be here next year. No one laughed, not even the man. He set the jar down, walked away. Frank watched him go, and something settled. Deep, uncomfortable, true. Have you ever realized in the middle of watching someone else that you were the one who'd been wrong all along? Not just mistaken, but fundamentally off. That's where Frank stood, right there on the courthouse steps. By August, the market was drawing people from 3 counties. Local papers started covering it. Small articles, then larger ones. Grassroots revival in Red Oak. Farmers bypass middlemen. Frank clipped everyone, kept them in a folder, didn't tell anyone, not even himself. Why? Walter kept showing up. Same coat, same table, same tractor. But he wasn't at the center anymore. The market had grown beyond him, and that was the point. One evening, after the crowd had cleared and the square was quiet again, Frank walked up to Walter. No clipboard this time. No file. Just, Frank, I was wrong, he said. Walter looked at him, waited. I thought efficiency meant scale, Frank continued. I thought survival meant expansion. I thought small meant dying. Walter nodded slowly. Sometimes it does, he said. Frank frowned. But sometimes, Walter added, small means you can change direction before something breaks. Frank let that sit. It didn't fix everything, but it explained something. And then Walter handed him something unexpected, a folded piece of paper. Frank opened it. Numbers, handwritten, weekly totals, vendor counts, estimated growth. Frank looked up. You've been tracking this? Walter shook his head. Clara has, he said. I just thought you'd understand it better than I do. Frank stared at the page. It was solid, not perfect, but real, actionable. For the first time, he saw a way to translate what was happening into something his world could recognize. He looked back at Walter. What do you want me to do with this? Walter didn't answer right away. He looked out at the empty square, then back at Frank. Just don't let them kill it, he said. And in that moment, Frank made a decision that would cost him more than any loan he'd ever approved. Frank Donnelly didn't sleep much the night of August 3rd, 1987. He sat at his kitchen table in Red Oak, a single lamp casting light over a spread of papers that didn't belong together by any traditional measure. Loan files, handwritten sales logs, newspaper clippings, and a yellow legal pad filled with numbers he had checked 3 times already. They didn't fit. That was the problem. And also the answer. At 7:45 a.m. Monday, he walked into First Plains Bank and requested a meeting with the regional board. Not a memo, not a report, a meeting. They gave him 20 minutes. He took 42. He didn't talk about sentiment, didn't mention nostalgia, didn't say a word about community spirit. He talked numbers, market circulation, cash velocity, local retention rates. He showed how every dollar spent at that Saturday market was being spent again in the diner, in the reopened hardware store, in fuel, in seed. He showed them something they hadn't considered. Stability, not growth, not expansion, sustainability. And then he said something that no one in that room expected. If we foreclose on these farms, he said, we don't recover assets. We erase the system that's starting to make them viable again. Silence. One board member leaned back. You're suggesting we bet on a roadside market? Frank shook his head. I'm suggesting we recognize one. He left the room not knowing if he still had a job. By Saturday, he had his answer. The bank issued a temporary hold on 5 foreclosures, including Walter Griggs. 6 months. Review pending. Frank drove to the square that morning. He didn't stand at the edge this time. He walked straight to Walter's table. And for the first time, he picked up a jar of honey. $5, he said. Walter nodded. Frank handed him the money. Didn't negotiate. Didn't question. Just paid. The market kept growing. By October, it averaged over 70 vendors. By December, the town council formally designated the courthouse square as a weekly public market space. Permits were introduced, but lightly, carefully. Frank helped design them, not to control, to protect. Let me tell you about what happened next. 5 years later, in 1992, Red Oak's population decline had stopped. Not reversed dramatically, but stabilized. The hardware store expanded. The diner hired 3 more staff. 2 young families bought land within 10 miles of town, something that hadn't happened in nearly a decade. The market was still there, every Saturday, rain or shine. The Farm-O-Lem was still there too, not always at Walter's table, sometimes at Clara's, sometimes at Earl's, sometimes just parked at the edge, engine off like it was resting, but it always came back. Walter Griggs passed away in November of 1994, peacefully, in his sleep, 79 years old. He never missed a Saturday until the last one. At his funeral, Frank Donnelly spoke, not as a banker, as a man who had learned something he couldn't unlearn. He showed me something I was trained not to see, Frank said. And once I saw it, I couldn't go back. The farm didn't disappear. A young couple took it over, leased at first, then bought, slowly, over time. They kept the tractor, maintained it, used it, not because it was efficient, but because it was enough. By 2002, the Red Oak Saturday Market had become a model study by small towns across the Midwest. Not replicated exactly. It couldn't be, because it wasn't just a system. It was a relationship between people, between land, between past and present. Frank stayed at the bank, but he changed. He started asking different questions, looking for different signals, trusting things that didn't fit neatly into reports. He still used numbers, but he stopped pretending they were the only truth. Every Saturday he went to the market. Sometimes he bought honey, sometimes nothing. Sometimes he just stood there, listening, watching, remembering. The Farm-O-Lem still starts on the second pull of the choke, still runs with that same steady rhythm, still carries the weight of hands that are gone. And every now and then a child climbs up onto the seat and asks if it still works. And someone always answers the same way, better than most things that replaced it. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. If you've ever known someone like Walter, someone who kept showing up when everyone else had already decided it was over, tell me about them in the comments. Those stories matter more than people think. And if you want to hear about the farmer in Clay County who refused to sell his land during the drought of '88 and ended up feeding 3 towns with one well nobody believed in, that story is coming. You want to be here for it.